Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm here, as always, with Dr. Justin Smith.
Good to be here.
We have been studying the book of Exodus together, and primarily we're focusing on the first 20 chapters, which are most of the highlights, things that you would consider as you're thinking of what is in the book of Exodus. And this evening, we are getting to the 10 Commandments, which have shaped human history, perhaps almost more than anything else, I would say.
Yeah.
As far as written documents, there's a lot today that we would recognize as just how things should be, perhaps, that was not necessarily taken for granted. It's the way for God is creating some laws that I think are really important, and generally everybody would raise their hand and say, yeah, that seems like how you would start a good society.
Yeah.
But these are things that wouldn't have been necessarily taken for granted in that time, in that place.
Sure.
So I'll go ahead and read from Exodus chapter 20 and just get through the 10 Commandments for us right now, and then we'll discuss them for a bit. Then God gave the people all these instructions. I'm the Lord your God who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. You must not have any other God but me. You must not make for yourself an idol of any kind or an image of anything in the heavens or on the earth or in the sea. You must not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God who will not tolerate the affection for any other gods. I lay the sin of the parents upon their children. The entire family is affected, even children in the third and fourth generations of those who reject me. But I lavish unfailing love for 1,000 generations on those who love me and obey my commands. You must not misuse the name of the Lord your God. The Lord will not let you go unpunished if you misuse his name. Remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your livestock, and any foreigners living among you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and everything in them, but on the seventh day he rested. This is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath and set it apart as holy. Honor your father and mother. Then you will live a long, full life in the land the Lord your God is giving you. You must not murder. You must not commit adultery. You must not steal. You must not testify falsely against your neighbor. You must not covet your neighbor's house. You must not cover your neighbor's wife. You must not cover your neighbor's male or female servant, ox or donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. When the people heard the thunder and the loud blast of the ram's horn, and when they saw the flashes of lightning and the smoke billowing from the mountain, they stood at a distance, trembling with fear. And they said to Moses, "You speak to us and we will listen, but don't let God speak directly to us or we'll die." "Don't be afraid," Moses answered them, "for God has come in this way to test you, and so that your fear of him will keep you from sinning." As the people stood at a distance, Moses approached the dark cloud where God was. So there we have it.
Yep.
The 10 Commandments, something that is, again, still very influential in how we think today. What are some things that jump out to you from this?
Well, I always sort of find it interesting that the first few commandments, I would say, probably up through, right before honor your father and mother. So about the first half of the commandments are really about our relationship with God, God's relationship with us, right? So taking God's name in vain, not worshiping other gods, worshiping idols, the Sabbath. I mean, the Sabbath in its own way sort of maybe functions as this transition point between commandments that seem very much directly related to our relationship with God and then ones that seem very much related to our relationships with others, which, even though this isn't at play at this point, you and I have talked a lot about at various points, not so much maybe in this series, but at other points, this double love command that Jesus issues to love God and love neighbor. Well, the 10 Commandments are sort of, mirror that, house that, right? Yeah. This act of loving God is certainly loving neighbors. How we love neighbors is loving God, but there seems to be this, again, a certain series or a certain number of these that are very much directly related to how we interact with God or how we worship God or where we place God in this sort of larger conversation. And then the interactions that we have with neighbors. How do we treat one another? So community building probably on both ends. And then Sabbath sort of, to me, is kind of it ends up being that bridge point where Sabbath is where we are relating with God that one time a week, but it's also a community celebration, right? Or it's a community observance. So sort of that interesting bridge point, I think, between those spaces.
Yeah, and I think it's just interesting thinking about this communally, how God has rescued these people from slavery, and because of that, like, here are some things that are going to help you live in a different kind of community. Pharaoh is introduced, and it is just so interesting to think about how Genesis 1 opens up, and Genesis 2 says that Adam and Eve are together. They feel no shame even though they're naked. And then immediately that first family gets into trouble. Cain and Abel, death happens. Then just really the disaster of many of the families that are in Genesis. It's these patriarchal narratives, and just it's a mess everywhere. Like, everyone's doing stuff. You're like, whoa, I thought my family was a little messed up. Like, it's just really just bizarre how things are just collapsing and breaking down. And then you see it, the brokenness of the world in Genesis is breaking families and turning people against each other. And then you see it on almost like this, okay, this is what systemic evil looks like in Pharaoh. Pharaoh is in charge, and he is now oppressing a group of people. The beginning of of Exodus, you see racism, you see just no thought for human life or anything, just that is anti the way that God would rule the world and how God would reign.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to me, so much of what we're seeing here, and I think the Ten Commandments become sort of this hallmark moment for them, this definitive moment. It's this idea of our God is not like other gods, right? And so much of what I see God trying to do in the book of Exodus is precisely that, this differentiation, this distinction between him and the others. Now, for those who have been reading this narrative right through Genesis up to this point, we're already familiar with the idea that God is distinct, that God is different. But remembering then that this narrative is taking place not just for those reading the text, but there's this demonstration to Pharaoh and the Egyptians, our God is not your God. And it's this demonstration of power, right, over these other gods and goddesses, this demonstration of power over the Pharaoh. And I think this, again, is almost the charter moment for Israel to say, so what does it look like then for us to be in relationship with God? What does it look like for us as a people? How are we going to conduct ourselves? If our God is different, and if our God is not like the other gods, then that would mean theoretically that we are not like the other people. So how are we not like the other people? So some of this is defining through the positive, here's who we are. And then some of this, I think, in its own way is defining through the negative. Here's who we are not, or here's what we don't do. So it's this moment now that these things are starting to crystallize around this common experience. Moses has been there in communication with God. Now God and the people are having this moment together, right? And again, I love this idea too, embedded in this moment and this experience of creating communal memory, right? So it's this idea that you have been there, you've stood at the foot of Sinai, you've seen the smoke, you've heard the thunder, you've heard the trumpet sounds, you have been scared out of your minds in the presence of God. Don't forget that. It's kind of what I see here. It's like, remember this and tell your kids about it and your grandkids about it and your great-grandkids about it, so that this becomes part of our collective experience.
Yeah, and it's, I think, just really interesting to see the things that God considers to be important to teach the people. Like, this is how you are to do this. And the idea of not worshiping an idol, not misusing the name of God, which I think is fascinating because I grew up learning don't cuss was in the Ten Commandments, which it isn't. I think it's
Yeah.
Perhaps not the best idea to cuss, but the idea that it's just about saying a bad word, really it's way more than that. And I think to a better standard where it says don't carry the name of God in the wrong way. And that could include some of the words that you say, but to limit it to that is an incorrect interpretation, that it's about how you carry God's name. And again, that idea of fear and God showing up, God's presence, that how you act Monday through Saturday is a reflection of you are carrying God's name. You are an image bearer of God. And if you're going to claim that you're a Christian, that changes some behavior pretty dramatically.
Yeah.
And if you're going to claim that I'm a follower of Jesus, I'm a follower of God, watch how you're walking, because you carry God's name in a certain way. And it's not enough to just say, oh, I don't cuss. That's not it.
Right.
And it's a great responsibility on all of us to recognize, I bear the name of God. Eventually the New Testament is going to even go a step further and say you are temples. Like your body is a temple to God.
Yeah.
So how you live, like what you choose to do with your body, it matters. So carry it in the right way. And I think it's a pretty unbelievable standard.
I mean, I think incredibly so. And, again, I guess if I could digress just for a moment, one of the things
that's what we do here.
Okay, good. All right. So one of the things that really does bother me about the way Christians oftentimes will use language in relationship to God is really centered in this 10 Commandments. So in the Hebrew, there is, as we've talked about, the proper name for God, if you will, right? His government name is the way I like to put it. It's what would have been on his ID. Mm-hmm. And it's in the consonants, it's YHWH. Scholarship has essentially come to the point of understanding that YHWH is probably pronounced Yahweh, right? Side note, Jehovah comes out of a mispronunciation of YHWH. The vowels are off. So those who persist in referring to God as Jehovah, it's a perhaps mispronounced version of Yahweh. So there's your trivia for tonight.
Sounds a little like Jay-Z's name.
Exactly. Right. So now that Christians have been introduced to the name Yahweh, I hear Christians use it a lot in praise and in different places. And I think oftentimes generally well-meaning. But the tradition within Judaism is you never say God's name. You never say it. And every time that it appears in the biblical text, they've put in different vowels to point the reader in the direction of saying, use this other name for God. So Elohim or any of the other names for God or the other descriptors for God. And so for me, the idea is, and the tradition within Judaism is, if you don't say God's name, then you won't take God's name in vain, right? You won't misuse it if you don't use it at all. Now, we could argue that maybe going way too far, that perhaps in God revealing his name to the Israelites, there is an intimacy there. I mean, we talked about that, right? It's in that moment in the burning bush, Moses says, who should I say? And God says, Yahweh. Right, and as you pointed out, it almost has the breathiness, right, of breathing, and that connects us so wonderfully back to Genesis, right, when God creates Adam and breathes into him, right, breathes life into him. So I mean, there's some really wonderful connections there. But as a personal thing for me, it's just, unless I'm speaking about it in like very academic context, and someone asks me a direct question, it's just something I try to avoid saying. I think out of respect for the tradition, but out of respect for this idea that there is something profoundly holy about God's name. And we run the risk of making it mundane and profane when we overuse it. So I think for me, it's just that reminder of the uniqueness and really specialness of God and God's name that comes out in this formative place in Israel's history.
Well, I think it always speaks to humility,
yeah,
and just the the proper way that you would hold the name of God. You know, like don't, it's literally the word there in Hebrew is like, don't carry it the wrong way.
Right.
And I think it's just so profound. Think about it that way. That it's like, you can't carry it arrogantly. And I think something that we see today that's so wrong with the American church in general is there's just an arrogance about, oh, we know exactly what God would want us to do on this, complex topic or this thing. And I just have some troubling news for those of you who might be tuned into this. Jesus is not a Republican or a Democrat. Jesus would just not be affiliated with either. And I think there's arrogance on both sides, and just acting like you just know is really dangerous. And it's the certainty that I think we always need to be careful of, because faith is never certain. The word faith means not certain. It's what it is. Yeah. And there's a certain way that we carry and a certain awe that we have about the mysterious nature of God. And that is apparent in these passages, and like the smoke and all these things, and just the awe that we all need. And we need to recalibrate ourselves to having an awe and sense of God's presence. And it's a challenge for us.
It's the way that I think we weaponize God and weaponize God's name, as though God stands in solidarity with our opinions or our proclivities. God stands above. And I think that's what is so deeply powerful about this narrative, right? There's something about God coming close here. But even in God coming close in this moment on Sinai, God is still wholly and completely other. There is something about God that we cannot manage, we cannot micromanage, we cannot get our arms around, that we cannot fully define or fully understand, and that God's name alone is deeply powerful, right? Deeply holy and to be respected. So the way that we have attempted to weaponize God's name in our favor, or weaponize God in our favor, I think is wholly problematic. And I think oftentimes we read the Ten Commandments again as a to-do list, or sometimes a to-don't list. And I think we miss what God is revealing about himself in these commandments. And I think that's where the focus ultimately is, not on what we should or shouldn't do, but who is God in this, and how is God revealing, and what is God revealing about himself here?
Yeah, and I think as I read through this, I just find it so fascinating that among do not murder, do not commit adultery, which we would say that's a good foundational piece for life, right? And we would all say, yeah, that's probably good for marriage and good for relationships with people, that you wouldn't kill them or have extramarital affairs like that. That's helpful. But then among that is keep the Sabbath. And I think it's very interesting how God is just very specific. Like you can't just get some foreigner slave that you have to do your work for you. Like, no. He or she gets a day off too. And the idea of even your animals, like let your animals rest. I just think this is so foreign. If God was to show up to us in 2021, United States, in the U.S., he would say, you got to get some Sabbath in your life. Yeah. You gotta get some Sabbath in your heart. And I think there's a lot of wiggle room for this as far as like how it can be interpreted. And unfortunately, I think that sometimes, and obviously Jesus is bucking against the trend that some of the Pharisees have made this into, and he says the Sabbath is made for man, not the other way around, that you should just consider, how could you have a day of joy, basically, that's not your usual thing. Yeah, I've heard it said before that perhaps if you work with your hands, you should take a break from working with your hands one day a week. For someone like me, whose hands are preaching hands.
I was going to say they're soft and uncalloused.
my preaching hands, I slave over a hot Bible. is helpful for me because it's not my natural inclination, and
Sure.
I found it to be blessing. And Manny would probably say a hearty amen here on this point, that it's helpful for me to sometimes work around the house on a day. I have Mondays off, like,
Sure.
and so Monday's a day. So you don't necessarily want me to do a home project, but just
Right.
to like think differently about how I view my home and my space and the things that I can do
Sure.
to like just instead of just kind of letting things
Yeah.
go and the list getting longer of little things that we need to do. So I think like it's not very specific, and that allows great grace. And that's what Jesus is bucking against by saying, no,
Sure.
it's supposed to be a blessing for man, but don't get it twisted. Jesus isn't saying don't practice it. And
Right.
I think if God was to come back right now and talk to us, this would be the number one thing. Because I think, honestly, this becomes a grace issue. And I don't think you can believe in grace very well and not have some rhythm of rest in your life.
Yeah.
To step back and say, I don't keep the world spinning.
Yeah.
And that's so beautiful. I remember when May and I got married, and I missed a couple weeks at church back in the day. This was over 10 years ago at this point. And the people who filled in for me apparently did a really great job. And so when I got back, I kept hearing about how great of a job they did. And I was like, all right, that's cool. But it was a little like, oh, all right. And I've learned to give that up and just be really happy when anybody does a great job preaching for us. But I remember that inclination as a young minister was like, whoa, I guess I got to prove my worth again. And it's just such a statement to be able to stand back from your work and just say, all right, I'm going to do some things proactively to say, I want to rest in this. And I think as Americans, especially with the technology, we're horrible at this. And you realize how addicted you are to technology when you try to step away from it. And we need to breathe a bit and say, I rest in grace. Like I'm going to not put in 80 hours of work.
Yeah.
I'm going to trust that the work is done. And that's a challenge to stand back and say, I'm going to trust in God to fill in the rest. And that's hard for us.
Well, and I think the grace part of this is what's really important, to be honest, because when you look at this, it's not just grace being extended to the Israelites, but the way that grace is being extended throughout the community. Your male or female slave, your livestock, the alien resident in your towns, everybody gets this day to rest, right? Refreshment, reconnection, that there is a modeling here, right, of what grace looks like lived out. And grace is rest. I don't know. It feels like now a lot of times our rest just looks like a different version of work. That even when we're quote unquote resting, we're not really resting. We're doing something else that we didn't do during the week because we didn't have time. And I don't know if I'm particularly good at this necessarily. I think I'm getting better at it, to be honest. And I've made some changes in my life and my schedule this last year, where I don't teach past 2:15 anymore. Part of it was we just realized how long Teddy was in daycare. I'd leave him in daycare at 7:30 in the morning, and I might not pick him up until 4 in the afternoon. And I didn't think about it, to be honest. I wasn't thinking about the hours. And then I started looking at that, and I'm going, no, I need better work-life balance, and I need to find ways to rest. So on Sundays now, we try to make that a day of rest. I mean, I don't know that we're always good at it. We may take our Sabbath at a different point in the week. It may not always be the same day. But I mean, I think this idea of rest and unplugging and recharging, but really reconnecting, I think is deeply important. And I just don't know that we always grasp the grace element of Sabbath. And I think it's really deeply important here.
Yeah, and you need to pause and recognize, as you think about the slaves coming out of Egypt, their identity is wrapped up in how many bricks they can make and like keeping that quota. And I would say we very much are in the same boat of just this constant going. And I was reading a book that was talking about the Sabbath, and the book said that in the 60s, so not that long ago, everything was closed on Sunday still.
Mm-hmm.
And that slowly started to change. And now it's only Chick-fil-A. And every once in a while, I think of going to Chick-fil-A on a Sunday, and I'm like, man, Chick-fil-A is closed. But it's just crazy that it's completely flipped to where there's just one example that I have. Yeah. And to go, I just think we're not recognizing what it's doing to our souls. Yeah. And this idea, and I think the Sabbath is just one example, but this whole teaching is about recognizing the sacredness of God and spending some time loving God, being devoted to God, not making these images that are just not actual representations of God, not doing these, not carrying God's name in the wrong way, going into a relationship then, honoring your father and mother. Don't kill people. Like it's this, all of this stuff, the way that you live, the nitty gritty is about honoring God. And I think we need some time to let God be the center and to stand back for a moment and say, yeah, there's something holy here that I don't often come close enough to realizing that I need in my heart and my life. And I need this centering space. I need God to do some things in me so I can have, the presence and the peace that I need. Yeah. I also love the end, don't covet. And I've heard it said before that you can't break any of the other 9 commandments without first breaking that. And I think that's true. That having a covetous, envious heart, looking around at what everybody else has, trying to compete with everybody else would cause you to break the Sabbath. Getting angry with somebody and then letting that upset anger spill out into murder like that. It begins with a heart of peace and rest and saying, God, I'm going to be content with what you have for me, and I'm not going to try and get more and more and force what's not there. I love the G.K. Chesterton line. There's 2 ways to get enough. One way is to continue to accumulate more and more, and the other is to desire less. And I think that, especially as you look into the life of Jesus, as this continues to be taught about, it's a downward mobility instead of an upward mobility. And I think it's so healthy to come from that perspective and to just say, all right, I'm gonna release some of this, and I'm not gonna respond in anger. I'm not gonna just live out every impulse with adultery. And obviously Jesus then expands this even more eventually, but to just think about God trying to create a community and saying, this is how it was in Egypt, and that's wrong. Like, that is sin going crazy to a point that it's systemic and gross and broken and racist and all this stuff. Like, let me breathe my life into you. Yeah. And this is gonna be better. Yeah. And I think oftentimes we think about our faith as just something that we are using for when we die. And this is like, no. This is a whole new way of living right now that ultimately is better for you. This is a pathway of life.
Well, 2 things to think about here too. I've done some reading recently that has sort of challenged me a little bit, with the idea being that Sabbath really only works in a space where everybody is working. So the idea being, when we are working, Sabbath then becomes this really important element of our lives, right? When you're out of work, Sabbath takes on a very different sort of experience, right? This is not a day of rest because you're not working. So it's interesting the way that work and Sabbath go hand in hand, and that one might even argue, if we're not in a situation where everybody in the community is working, then how does everybody actually enjoy that Sabbath? Like, really embrace that Sabbath, right? That Sabbath loses meaning without work, which is something we oftentimes don't think about. We don't think about needing work in order to Sabbath. And I kind of thought I had to pause for a minute. I go, I've worked really consistently since I was well, 14 or 15 years old, you know. But definitely from the time I was in high school until now, you know, there's been very few phases of my life when I haven't been working consistently. So Sabbath has always been a different thing for me in that way. But then the other thing, again, is later on at least, the idea of Sabbath will be used to critique Israel and be used to critique Jews. The critique will be that in the ancient world that Jews are lazy because they take a day off. And so it's interesting that this is already, I think, going to be something that points us in the direction of distinctiveness. I don't think because it's so much a part of who we are now in the West, you know, this idea of Sabbath and taking a day off, we don't think about it that way. But in the ancient world, this would have been very foreign to say, one day out of the week, we're not going to do any work. We're just going to stop. Everything grinds to a halt. Mm-hmm. People are ultimately going to look at that and go, what is wrong with you people? Yeah. Like, you're incredibly lazy for taking this whole day off. But what it does then is it demonstrates how different they are. We are not like everyone else. And we're not like everyone else because of our relationship with this God. And it's in this way then that we connect with one another and we connect with God.
And I think it takes intention too, where if you are lucky enough to only work 5 days a week, congratulations, you're one of the winners in human history. I mean, honestly, most people look at your life and look at my life and go, wow, how'd you even pull that off?
Right.
And it is a real challenge for us, though, to use that time in a God-honoring way.
Right.
And to say, all right, this is going to take me really thinking about it. Because again, it's not just some simple idea. It extends out to, take care of the slaves that are in your house. Like, watch for your oxen. Like, what does your ox get joy out of? And there's all this stuff, and just to really contemplate that. And I think that set apart nature, the distinctiveness of a community, is something that we need to really think about as we think about being people of faith. And what is it about your life that's any different from anybody else? And how would you say, like, I am worshiping God because of this? And part of that is being part of a church and showing up on Sunday as often as you can. I think that's true, but it extends way beyond that to how you act every day. And it's not just about some place that you go when you die. This is about a better life for you right now. And this is about you living with a certain sort of peace in your heart, and not living with envy or coveting everything, not living with a sense of anxiety and doing all these things. And can you just rest a bit in God and say, God, you're in charge. I'm going to do that first one well. I'm going to love you with all my heart. That's going to change how I love other people. Yeah. But ultimately, this is a pathway of life.
Well, it's interesting, and I think you've already kind of touched on this, and it will come up later in Israel's history, but this idea of coveting. I mean, ultimately, I think the break that we see between Israel and God, not God and Israel, but Israel and God, or the straining of this relationship, is when Israel starts to look around and covets the kings, covets the sort of political trappings that their neighbors have. And they go, we want what they have.
Yeah.
We want to be like them. And God says, once again, God is essentially saying to them, am I not enough?
Yeah.
Is this relationship not enough? And Israel's resounding response is, no, it's not.
Yeah.
We want something else. And this idea of wanting something else is relationship destroying. It can really just destroy these relationships. And so it's interesting here that embedded again in this sort of covenantal relationship and uniqueness is desire what you have. Desire what you already have. Be happy in that space. And yet that's one of the things I think we struggle with the most.
Yeah, it's a challenge, that's for sure. So I hope you spend some time really meditating on these passages and thinking about who it is that God is calling you to be, because it matters in your Monday through Saturday. You're following God, and God cares about that. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge God's holiness and God's desire for us to move forward in that way. So thank you as always to Justin, for being part of this conversation.
Thank you.
You're welcome to join us in just a few seconds on our prayer call on Zoom. You can email me for information, Brian with a Y at glendale.church. Thank you for joining us.